There's a long history of theorists and composers associating different keys with different meanings, suitable for different emotional expressions. The essential text on this is Rita Steblin's History of Key Characteristics, so shout out to Rita for making this video possible. She did a crazy amount of legwork, and she tracked down every manuscript that had anything to say about what different keys meant. So what's the deal here? Does C major really make music sound pure, noble, and simple, or was that just a byproduct of the fact that it doesn't have a key signature? From our modern vantage point, this doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Today, whether you play something in C major, or D major, or F sharp major doesn't change the underlying ratios. 12-tone equal temperament smooths everything out, such that each successive half step is related to the 12th root of 2. The practice of different keys having these subtle distinctions makes more sense when going back to earlier tuning practices, where C and D and E flat majors really did sound different. Systems that predate the dominance of 12 equally spaced notes all had different ways of spacing out those notes. Usually the goal was to get some keys to sound really pure by sacrificing the keys that nobody played in. The issue with linking key characteristics to temperament is that there were a number of different competing tuning systems. Johann Kernberger alone came up with 3 different well-tempered systems, seeking to maximize intervallic purity while making as many keys as usable as possible. You can't very well say that B-flat major has a certain characteristic based on very subtle micro-variations between the notes, and at the same time have as many different B-flat majors as there are competing mean tone or well-tempered tuning systems. That just doesn't fly, and yet it was the only reasonable way to explain these characteristics until equal temperament took over. That happened by the early 19th century. With the notable exception of organs, they're still usually tuned in some kind of well-tempered system, and yet musicians of all stripes retained strong feelings about the meaning of different keys. The practice didn't die off. You could argue that it actually got stronger. This wasn't just a factor of some composers being synesthetic, having some cross-wiring in their brains that allowed them to, for instance, see color when hearing certain tonalities. Adding to this complication is that if you look at lists of key characteristics from various commentators over the years, they don't always agree, which makes sense. And when they do agree, it tends to be because they're copying somebody else. They're reading these lists and coming up with their own based on what they've already read. One of the big names in the key characteristic space was Christian Friedrich Daniel Schubart, whose name always looks like a misspelling to me, and his commentary on the keys was picked up by a number of later sources, and it was treated as, if not gospel on the subject, at least an important text to know. The big problem was that equal temperament explanations had to supplant the unequally tempered explanations. Theorists began looking at sharps and flats on the circle of fifths, thinking of going sharp, going up by fifths from C as a brightening, and going flat as a darkening. This is a decent relative psychological explanation that persists to this very day.
Sort of this makes music very vivid to me in terms of understanding the bright and the dark side. So the bright side being, you start on C and go C, G, D, A, E, that's like that's brightening, and then C, F, B flat, E flat, A flat, that's darkening.
This makes the assumption that C major is the center, and it's never had a good explanation about minor key characteristics either. So, is this all just in people's heads? It might not actually be, because there are a few decent physical explanations. Like, the black keys on the piano are a little bit shorter, so supposedly they can't be hit with the same force as the white keys. At best, this is debatable. Some things are more obvious, like some instruments sound brighter in certain keys. This is especially true for string instruments. They really shine in keys like D major and A major because they can make use of those resonant open strings. Certain wind and brass instruments also resonate better in certain keys based on how they're made. For a long time, trumpets could only play fanfares in one of a few select keys, which help lend those keys martial characteristics. Because if you only heard trumpets in the few keys they could play in the classical era, maybe you'd start to associate those keys with the military. Point is, there were some good physical reasons why people would, over time, come to associate certain keys with certain properties. The trouble is that this assumes a critical mass of people had perfect pitch, and also for a long time the exact frequency of the tuning A varied noticeably, even from town to town. My town's A might sound closer to your town's B flat. The mystery of key characteristics, in my view, is that of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Writers opined on the subject, they came to a general consensus on meanings, and they cited pieces from the repertoire that conformed to those characteristics, which then became part of the narrative of those keys, encouraging more and more composers to lean into these supposedly innate characteristics. Some composers, for whatever reason, found certain keys special and reserved them for certain pieces or certain moments. Beethoven's use of C minor comes to mind. Beethoven's C minor was not Mozart's C minor. But post-Beethoven, C minor now meant something more because of what Beethoven did with it. And if you're a composer working at an instrument, you're going to have a tactile relationship between how different keys physically feel to play. Something that's very idiomatic in one key on one instrument might be dreadful in another. It's why Chopin thought B major was easy. I mean, sure, there are a lot of sharps, but it physically feels good to play. It sits well under the hands. I know I've never really quite liked F sharp major because I don't like how it feels to play, but I've never associated the sound of it with anything negative. So I'm curious, do you hear different keys differently? Do they mean different things to you? And if so, why?